Three infants were born on the same night in Henry County, Virginia. In April of 1802, three identical newborn cries echoed through the stillness of a plantation house. But only two of those children would ever be recognized by their mother. The third child, whose skin tone differed from his siblings by what witnesses later described as barely a shade, like the color of summer sun on the skin, disappeared from the family's records within hours of being born. Whatever happened inside that delivery room stayed hidden for over 2 centuries, buried inside courthouse files, private letters, and whispered accounts shared only among enslaved women. Local authorities never stepped in. The family name was scrubbed from most written histories. But tonight, we're going to piece together what truly happened when Margaret Fairmont delivered triplets and made a choice that would tear apart every life connected to that night. Before we move deeper into the twisted history of the Fairmont Plantation and the night when everything changed, I need you to do one thing. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this, the ones locked in dusty archives and erased from polite family histories, aren't being told anywhere else. And drop a comment telling me which state or city you're watching from. I want to know where you're tuning in from as we uncover these hidden and unsettling chapters of American history. Now, let's go back to Virginia, 1802, a world where appearances meant survival, and where one woman's secret fear sealed the fate of her own child. The spring of 1802 brought more than warm breezes to the tobacco estates along the James River. Henry County stretched across rolling Virginia hills, a patchwork of plantations where fortunes rose and collapsed with each tobacco harvest. The Fairmont Plantation commanded almost 800 acres of fertile river bottom land, all of it worked by 43 enslaved people whose labor had carried the family across 3 generations of wealth. The main house stood proudly on a rise in the land, a 2-story brick home with white columns visible even from the river road. A quiet announcement of prosperity to anyone passing by. Margaret Fairmont had arrived there 6 years earlier, a 17-year-old bride brought from her family's smaller Williamsburg estate. She was the youngest daughter of the Sutherland family, a lineage that boasted English noble blood, something her mother managed to insert into every conversation. Her marriage to Thomas Fairmont was celebrated as a flawless arrangement. Old money joining established land, beauty combined with social respectability. Thomas, who was 15 years older than Margaret, ran his plantation with a firm, meticulous mindset of a man who had inherited responsibility early and took it seriously. But by 1802, that carefully polished image had begun to crack in ways only those inside the home could see. Margaret had suffered 2 miscarriages during her first 3 years of marriage. The first loss was mourned quietly. The second plunged her into a long season of melancholy that lasted the entire winter, leaving her too fragile to leave her bedroom. Thomas slowly grew distant, spending more time inspecting the fields or riding off to Richmond for business matters that seemed to multiply. The pressure produced an air weighed heavily on both of them, but Margaret felt it most sharply. Her mother's letters arrived weekly, each filled with some pointed reminder about cousins who had already birthed children, neighbors whose families were growing, or the natural duty of a wife to secure her husband's legacy. So when Margaret conceived again in summer of 1801, the entire household seemed to breathe easier. Thomas became attentive once more. Margaret's mother visited frequently and pronounced the pregnancy blessed. Even the enslaved women working inside the house prepared the nursery with unusual care, perhaps sensing that this child represented more than just another addition to the family. What no one expected was that Margaret wasn't carrying one child. She carried 3. The truth revealed itself late in the pregnancy. Dr. Edmund Yancey, who served the county's wealthiest families, examined Margaret in February and noted what he called unusual movement, suggesting multiple quickening. A second examination in March confirmed his suspicion. Margaret was expecting twins, possibly even triplets. The news sent Margaret spiraling between joy and fear. Thomas accepted the announcement with quiet satisfaction, already imagining the advantage of multiple heirs. But Margaret knew something he didn't, something she had never confessed to anyone, not even her husband. She had a reason to fear what her babies might look like. Working inside the Fairmont household was a woman named Esther, born on the property 28 years earlier. Esther handled the more delicate duties, tasks the elder Mrs. Fairmont had trained her for before her death. She moved through the house with steady, silent efficiency, always present when needed, and nearly invisible when she wasn't. Esther herself had given birth twice, though neither child survived infancy, a heartbreaking reality so common among enslaved families that the plantation records mention it only with a cold notation of increase followed by decrease in Thomas's ledger. During her pregnancy, Margaret developed an unusual dependence on Esther. She insisted Esther, not the younger house girls, attend her each morning. She wanted Esther present for every visit from Dr. Yancey. She even requested that Esther sleep in the small servant room near the master bedroom, claiming she needed help during the night. Thomas found this strange but didn't challenge it. A pregnant woman's whims were meant to be indulged, and if Esther brought comfort, then fine. What Thomas didn't know, what Margaret prayed he would never uncover, was that his absence the previous summer had not gone unnoticed. In July 1801, Thomas had traveled to Williamsburg for 3 weeks to settle a complicated estate issue involving his mother's family, a trip long planned. Margaret remained at the plantation, insisting the brutal heat made travel impossible in her delicate condition, though she wasn't yet showing. With Thomas gone, the house felt different, quieter, strangely suspended in time. Margaret left her room more often, walking the grounds in the cool early hours, drinking tea on the back veranda where she could watch the distant fields. 19 enslaved men worked the Fairmont land that summer. Most tended the tobacco, others handled the stables or worked as carpenters and blacksmiths. Among them was a man named William, purchased 3 years earlier from a Maryland plantation when Thomas needed an additional skilled laborer. William was trained as a carpenter, skilled in the fine, intricate work the plantation occasionally needed. He was also noticeably lighter-skinned than most of the enslaved people at Fairmont, the son of a white overseer and an enslaved woman. This fact appeared plainly in his sale documents, though no one on the plantation ever spoke of it aloud. Whatever happened between Margaret and William during Thomas's absence was never written in a letter, never recorded in any diary, never mentioned officially anywhere. But 9 months later, on the night of April 23rd, 1802, when Margaret's labor began, she understood all too well that there was a possibility, small, yes, but undeniably real, that the newborn children she carried might reveal a truth capable of destroying her entire life. Her labor started shortly after sunset. Margaret's water broke during dinner, throwing the entire household into a state of controlled chaos. Thomas immediately dispatched a rider to fetch Dr. Yancey. The doctor lived 8 miles away and might not arrive for hours. Esther was called to Margaret's room at once, along with another enslaved woman named Ruth, who had experience assisting in difficult births. Meanwhile, Thomas paced the hallway downstairs, doing what men of his position were expected to do, drinking brandy and waiting for news, helplessly. Upstairs, Margaret's terror came close to hysteria. She clung to Esther's hand with a crushing grip, her eyes wild and frantic. Between contractions, she whispered disjointed fragments, words Ruth couldn't make sense of, but which made Esther's expression tighten into something unreadable. "You have to help me," Margaret gasped, sweat pouring down her face. "Whatever happens, you have to help me. Promise me. Promise." Esther nodded slowly, understanding far more than Ruth could. The first child arrived just before midnight, a strong, healthy boy who screamed with force the moment he entered the world. Ruth wrapped him in clean linen and laid him gently in a prepared cradle. Thomas was summoned and appeared upstairs with a genuine smile, the first real one he'd worn in months. He looked at his son briefly, then returned downstairs to give the women space. The second child came an hour later, another boy smaller but just as lively. Thomas was called up again, and now his satisfaction was tinged with astonishment at his sudden abundance of heirs. "Is that all?" he asked Dr. Yancey, who had arrived moments before the second birth. "There may be a third," the doctor replied after examining Margaret. "Her labor hasn't finished." The third child was born at 2:17 a.m. Ruth caught him in her steady, experienced hands. And then, for just a moment, the room fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. This infant was darker than his brothers, not dramatically so. His skin looked like that of someone who had spent a summer in the sun, or perhaps like a child with Mediterranean ancestry. But the difference was unmistakable. Where the first two infants were pale and flush pink, this child had a warm golden brown hue, a shade that would deepen with age. His features were subtly distinct, yet still unmistakably kin to the others. Margaret laid eyes on him and let out a sound halfway between a sob and a whimper. Her greatest fear had taken form in flesh. Dr. Yancey frowned and leaned closer. Ruth stared between all three infants, confusion clouding her face. But Esther moved quickly, taking the third baby from Ruth's hands. "Miss Margaret needs rest," Esther said firmly. "She's lost too much blood. Dr. Yancey, you should prepare a tonic. Ruth, fetch fresh linens from the chest downstairs." Her tone carried such authority that both Ruth and the doctor obeyed without hesitation. As they turned away, Esther and Margaret locked eyes. There, in silence, something passed between them. An agreement, a plea, a shared understanding of the consequences. "The third child is weak," Esther announced loudly enough for the doctor to hear as he mixed a tonic. "Breathing poorly. Might not make it through the night." The infant wasn't weak at all. He was crying with strength, but Esther held him pressed against her body, muffling the sound. In dim candlelight, with exhaustion dulling everyone's senses, it became possible to believe her words. "Common with triplets," Dr. Yancey muttered. "The third often fails to thrive." Thomas was never summoned to see his third son. Instead, Dr. Yancey went downstairs and informed him that while two healthy boys had been delivered, a third child had been born frail and unlikely to survive until morning. Thomas accepted this news with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. Two heirs were already more than most men could expect. If God intended to take the third, perhaps it was for the best. Triplets were unusual, almost unnatural. Two sons provided a much neater story, a cleaner legacy. By 3 a.m., the house had quieted. Dr. Yancey left instructions for Margaret's recovery and rode home. Thomas, drunk on brandy and celebration, fell asleep in his study. Ruth returned to the servants' quarters. Only Esther stayed in Margaret's room, holding the third infant. "What will you do?" Margaret whispered, trembling. "What you asked me to do," Esther replied. "Hide him. He can't stay here. Thomas can't see him. No one can know. I understand. You'll take care of it." Margaret's eyes were feverish, frantic. "You promise?" Esther gazed down at the child. He had fallen asleep, his small chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of perfect health. She remembered holding her own babies in arms just like this, babies who had not survived. She remembered their weight, their fragility, their innocence. "Yes," Esther said softly, "I promise." What she did afterward would haunt Henrico County for generations. The plantation lay quiet in the darkness, a landscape of shadows Esther knew better than anyone. She had walked these grounds all her life, knew every building, every tree, every place where she could be seen, and every place where she could not. With the infant wrapped against her body beneath her shawl, she moved through the night. Her first destination was a small cabin she shared with 3 other unmarried women. But as she approached, she saw a lamplight glowing through cracks. Someone inside was awake. So Esther turned, shifting direction without hesitation. The plantation had dozens of outbuildings, tobacco barns, storage sheds, workshops, smokehouses. Most were locked at night, but Esther knew every door that didn't latch properly, every window that stayed loose. She moved with purpose until she reached the old dairy house, a small stone structure that had been replaced by a newer, larger building the previous year. The old one was still used now and then for storage, but for the most part, It sat empty and forgotten. Esther slipped inside. The space smelled of damp stone and sour milk, an old, lingering scent that wasn't entirely unpleasant. She could hear mice rustling behind the walls and the soft drip of water falling from a loose roof board overhead. The infant stirred against her chest but didn't wake. Standing there in the dark, holding a child who wasn't hers yet felt like her responsibility, Esther found her thoughts circling around Margaret's frantic whispers. Hide him. Make sure no one knows. You promised. But what exactly did Margaret think would happen? Did she truly believe Esther could simply make a newborn vanish from the world? Did she expect Esther to carry out the kind of act no one dared speak aloud? The possibility hung heavy in the air, thick as the scent of mildew. Esther knew what desperate women sometimes did. She had heard the whispers in the quarters, stories of infants who somehow failed to thrive, babies who suddenly fell sick, births that ended in convenient tragedies. Small graves dotted the plantation cemetery, marked only in Thomas's ledger books as increases and decreases, nameless numbers erased before the next harvest. One more infant death would barely register. She could do it. She could end the child's life quickly, quietly, one piece of cloth pressed over a tiny mouth. Leave him here in the old dairy and later claim he had passed in the night, just as Dr. Yancey warned he might. Margaret would be relieved. Thomas would never suspect. The secret would die with the baby, buried in the family plot among countless unnamed children. But when Esther looked down at the child's sleeping face, she couldn't see his skin tone in the darkness. He wasn't evidence of betrayal now. He was simply a baby, a child born into circumstances far beyond his control. And Esther thought of her own children, both lost before they reached their first birthdays. She thought of Margaret's choice, the power to decide which of her children deserved a future and which deserved erasure. Margaret's decision had nothing to do with health or strength. It was based solely on color, on guilt, on fear. Esther made a choice of her own then, a choice that was equal parts mercy and vengeance. She left the old dairy and continued deeper into the plantation, moving past the work buildings toward the cluster of cabins where enslaved families lived. These cabins were arranged in uneven rows, each crowded with multiple families. Esther walked toward the smallest one at the far end, a place where a woman lived alone. Dinah was 53, ancient by plantation standards. She had spent her life in the tobacco fields until arthritis twisted her hands into aching knots. Too crippled to work the fields now, but too healthy to be dismissed entirely, she existed in a strange in-between state. She mended clothes, mixed herbs for the sick, and watched over children when their parents labored from dawn to dusk. She had buried 2 husbands and 4 children. Even she didn't know how she'd survived as long as she had. Esther knocked softly. Dinah opened the door almost instantly, as though she had been waiting. "You bring something that needs hiding," Dinah said. It wasn't a question. Her eyes dropped a bundle in Esther's arms. Miss Margaret's 3rd child, born different from the others. Her expression didn't shift. After 50 years, nothing surprised her anymore. "Different how?" she asked. "Darker," Esther replied. "Shows his father's blood. Miss Margaret don't want him. Says he's weak. Says he won't make it. But he will, won't he?" Dinah said, studying Esther, not the child, but Esther. "If someone cares for him right," Esther said. "That's why I'm here." Dinah went quiet for a long time, weighing the moment. "Say it plain, Esther. What you asking?" "Raise him," Esther answered. "Keep him hidden. Tell folks he's your grandson if they ask. You so old now nobody questions your business. And if Master Thomas sees a new baby in the quarters, Master Thomas don't come down here," Dinah cut in. "None of them do, unless there's trouble. Long as the fields run and work gets done, he don't care who sleeps in what cabin." That was true enough. The enslaved quarters operated under a kind of shadowed autonomy, ignored unless needed. Children appeared and disappeared constantly. Birth, death, sale, escape. Thomas didn't bother keeping track. To him, they were numbers. "You know what you're asking?" Dinah said quietly. Raising a white man's child in secret? That's dangerous. I know, Esther said. Why not just do what she wants? Make him disappear proper? Esther's jaw clenched. Because I won't kill a child for his mother's sin. Dinah studied the baby again, her weathered face unreadable. Finally, she reached out and took the bundle from Esther. The baby stirred, made a soft noise, then relaxed against Dinah's chest as though he had always belonged there. What's his name? Dinah asked, and Esther realized Margaret had never given him one. He had been born already condemned, stripped even of that smallest dignity. Samuel, Esther said softly, speaking the first name that came to her. Call him Samuel. Samuel, Dinah echoed, testing the sound. All right then, Samuel it is. I'll help, Esther promised. Bring food when I can. Clothes, whatever he needs. This is going to end bad, Dinah said, yet there was something like satisfaction beneath her words, as if she found a dark thrill in keeping a secret this dangerous, this defiant. You know that, right? Secrets like this don't stay buried. Maybe, Esther said, but not tonight. By dawn, she returned to the main house. Margaret sat awake, hollow-eyed, trembling. It's done, Esther said simply. Margaret couldn't finish the sentence. He won't be found, Esther replied. No one will know. Margaret closed her eyes and exhaled shakily. Relief washed over her face. Thank you, she whispered. You saved me. Esther didn't answer. She hadn't saved Margaret. She had merely moved the problem, turned Margaret's secret into something alive, something growing, something that would eventually explode. But she had saved a life. And in the moral balance Esther lived by, that mattered more. Life on the plantation moved forward with a kind of routine that felt almost sinister. Margaret recovered from childbirth, doting on the two sons everyone acknowledged, Thomas Jr. and Henry, both growing healthy and strong. Yet in a small cabin at the far edge of the quarters, a third child was learning how to exist in the spaces between being seen and being forgotten. Samuel's first year unfolded in a fragile state of near invisibility. Dinah raised him with a surprising gentleness. This woman who had already buried for her own children and survived more loss than anyone should. She kept him hidden inside her cabin during the day, bringing him out only at dawn or dusk, when most people were busy elsewhere. When anyone asked about the baby's sudden appearance, Dinah told a simple story. Her daughter, sold away 5 years earlier to a plantation in North Carolina, had died in childbirth, and the master there had sent the baby back to her as an unlikely act of mercy. It was believable enough. Such arrangements happened sometimes, and Thomas never questioned it, because Thomas never asked. As long as the work continued, Dinah's private life was irrelevant to him. Esther visited the cabin often, bringing food, scraps of cloth, and anything the child needed. She watched Samuel grow, watched him smile for the first time, learn the early sounds he made long before they became words. And as he aged, she watched his skin darken, just slightly at first, but enough to reveal the truth that had been clear from the moment of his birth. The evidence of mixed ancestry would only deepen with time. Meanwhile, in the main house, Thomas Jr. and Henry thrived. Thomas hired a wet nurse, then a nursery maid. He even commissioned a portrait of the twins for their first birthday. Two pale-faced boys dressed in matching white gowns, immortalized in oil paint by a traveling artist from Richmond. The portrait hung in the main parlor, a proud declaration of lineage. Margaret looked at it every single day, and every day she thought about the third face that should have been there, but wasn't. Her relationship with Esther had shifted. What had once been a mistress's casual dependence on a trusted servant was now something tangled, heavy, and silent. A shared secret, a shared danger. Margaret couldn't meet Esther's eyes anymore, and Esther, in turn, served with a cold precision. Distance was the only way she'd continue doing her duties. Thomas noticed none of this. His world revolved around plantation business, tobacco contracts, long trips to Richmond for legislative sessions. His family was healthy. His fields were promising. Life in his eyes was unfolding exactly as it should. But in the quarters, the truth moved differently. Samuel's real parentage became known the way secrets always do. Through whispered conversations in the dark, through careful glances, through long experience reading things white men never saw. People noticed that Esther watched the child with a fierce, instinctive protectiveness. They noticed that Dinah received slightly better rations than she should have. They noticed that Master Thomas's sons and Dinah's grandson shared certain unmistakable features. The same curve of the jawline, the same set of the ears, a familiar pattern in the hairline. Similarities that only grew sharper with time. Most enslaved people kept this knowledge buried. Exposing the truth would help no one and would almost certainly destroy all involved. But a few saw opportunity instead of danger. Among them was Jacob, one of Thomas's field overseers. Jacob lived in the uneasy space between authority and bondage, enslaved but granted power over others, a position that demanded constant negotiation, constant survival. Jacob had ambitions. He longed to be noticed, to be indispensable, maybe even earn favors that could one day buy his freedom. And so Jacob watched. He watched Esther's trips to Dinah's cabin. He watched how certain women subtly shielded the child from white eyes. He studied Samuel's features. He calculated the timing of births. And he waited for the moment when this information could serve him. That moment arrived in the spring of 1804. Samuel was 2 years old, and the resemblance between him and the Fairmont twins could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Jacob approached Thomas early one morning, while the master was inspecting new rows of tobacco. "Master Fairmont, sir," Jacob said, shifting his weight carefully. "Might I have a word? There's something you ought to hear, something concerning your family." Thomas straightened, irritation giving way to a sharper tension. "What is it, Jacob? Speak plainly." Jacob lowered his voice. "It's a delicate matter, sir. A matter involving Miss Margaret and the children." Jacob hesitated, letting his silence work for him, performing reluctance just enough to make his words seem heavier. "There's a child in the quarters, sir. Old Dinah's boy says he's her grandson from North Carolina. But, sir, that ain't the truth." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting, sir, that you take a look at the child yourself. Compare him to your own sons, and see what you see." Thomas's expression went still, almost carved from stone. "You're making a serious implication, Jacob." "Yes, sir, I know I am, but I thought you should hear it from me before others start talking." Thomas was a foolish man. He could do the math, dates, circumstances, details, as well as anyone. He thought about the pregnancy, about the third child who had supposedly died, about how much time Margaret had spent with Esther. He thought about William, the light-skinned carpenter suddenly sold away to Georgia a year earlier. He'd told himself at the time that selling William was smart business. The man's skill brought a good price. But now, looking back, Thomas wondered if there had been another reason, some instinct he'd felt but refused to name. "Take me to this child," Thomas said. His voice was low and dangerously calm. Jacob led him to Dinah's cabin. It was mid-morning. Most people were working, but Dinah was old enough to be excused from field labor. She sat on a stool outside her door, and beside her, playing with a carved wooden toy, was Samuel. Thomas stopped 10 feet away. The boy looked up, and Thomas froze. The child's eyes were unmistakably his. The shape of the face, the angle of the shoulders, the way he tilted his head, exactly the same way Thomas himself did. The resemblance wasn't subtle. It hit Thomas like a physical blow. "Where did this child come from?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. Dinah stood slowly, her joint stiff with age. "My grandson, sir, my daughter's boy from North Carolina." "Your daughter's been dead 8 years, Dinah," Thomas said sharply. "I know, because I sold her to the Cass Plantation in '96, and they reported her death from fever the next year. So I'll ask you again, Where did this child come from? Dinah kept her face still, unreadable, saying nothing. Thomas looked at Samuel again, at the boy who wore his face. His mind raced back to the night Margaret gave birth to the third son, who was supposedly too weak to live, to Esther's close attention, to the possibility he had never dared allow into his thoughts. How old is a child? Thomas demanded. 2 years, sir. Born spring of 1802. Thomas felt something inside him crack, a fracture deep in the foundation of everything he believed about his life. He turned and walked back toward the main house, first quickly, then nearly running. Margaret was in the morning room, embroidering while the twins played with wooden soldiers. She looked up as Thomas burst in, his face flushed with rage. "Get the children out," Thomas said, his voice terrifyingly controlled. "Now." The nursery maid swept the twins away, sensing danger like an animal fleeing a fire. Margaret rose slowly, her embroidery falling from her hands. "Thomas, what?" "Tell me about the third child," he cut in. "The one who died." Margaret went completely white. I don't understand. He was weak. He didn't survive." "Don't lie to me." Thomas's shout struck her like a blow. "I've seen him. A 2-year-old boy in the quarters. A boy who has my face." Margaret collapsed into her chair, trembling. "It's not possible," she whispered. "Esther said she promised he was gone." "Gone where, Margaret? Gone how?" Thomas grabbed her shoulders, forcing her eyes up to his. "What did you do? What secret have you been keeping?" The story spilled out in broken pieces. Margaret's loneliness while Thomas was in Williamsburg, her conversations with William the carpenter, how kindness became something more dangerous, how the pregnancy might have been Thomas's or William's, how 3 sons were born and one was too dark to be acknowledged. "I was frightened," Margaret sobbed. "I didn't know what to do. If anyone saw him, they'd know. It would destroy everything. You'd cast me out. My family would disown me. I'd lose my sons." "So you gave him away," Thomas said coldly. "You gave away my son. My son, Margaret. Whatever else he is, he's mine." This was the truth Margaret had been too terrified to understand. She had seen the baby as evidence of her betrayal, something to erase. But Thomas saw him as property, as lineage, as something that belonged to him, because everything on the plantation belonged to him. Margaretson didn't erase ownership. Nothing could. "Where's Esther?" he demanded. Esther was summoned. She walked into the room slowly, bracing herself. Thomas stood by the fireplace, gripping the mantel so tightly his knuckles were white. Margaret sat broken in her chair, staring at nothing. "You took the child," Thomas said. "You were supposed to dispose of it, but instead you took him to Dinah. Why?" Esther met his eyes steadily. "Miss Margaret asked me to hide him, so I hid him." "She asked you to kill him." "She asked me to hide him," Esther repeated. "I did what was asked." "Don't play word games with me," Thomas snarled. "You knew what she meant." "Did I, sir?" Esther replied softly. "I'm just a slave. I don't always understand the fine meanings when white folks want their problems to disappear." Her tone was subtle, but the defiance was unmistakable. Rage surged inside Thomas, the kind that could turn violent in an instant. But beneath the rage, something colder stirred, the realization that Esther held power now, knowledge more dangerous than any weapon, knowledge that could destroy the Fairmont name. Reputation would be ruined if such news spread, and Thomas knew it. He finally spoke, his voice tight with frustration. "You've put me in an impossible position. That child cannot stay here. His presence is a constant reminder of my wife's betrayal, and his resemblance to my legitimate sons will cause endless speculation." "Then sell him," Esther said flatly. "Sell him away like you sell anyone else who becomes inconvenient." Margaret made a small sound of protest, but Thomas ignored her. "He's 2 years old," Thomas said, "too young to sell for any meaningful profit, and any buyer would ask questions about his parentage, questions I cannot afford to have asked." So what will you do? Esther asked. Thomas stared at her for a long moment. That depends on whether you can keep your mouth shut. This secret stays here, between the four of us. Me, Margaret, you, and Dina. The child continues to live in the quarters as Dina's grandson. No one speaks of his real parentage, ever. If this information leaves this room, if there is even a whisper beyond this plantation, I will hold you personally responsible. Do you understand? Yes, sir. I could have you whipped for this, Thomas said quietly. For concealing information, for disobeying orders, for your insolence today. Give me one reason I shouldn't. Because then you'd have to explain why, Esther replied. And that is a conversation you don't want to have. They stared at each other, master and slave, caught in a quiet web of compromise that twisted their usual power dynamic into something neither fully controlled. Get out, Thomas said finally, and send Dina to me. We need to establish some rules. Dina came to the main house walking slowly, her face calm but resigned. She had always known this day would come. Secrets that large never stayed buried forever. Thomas met her in his study, a room lined with ledgers and law books. The administrative heart of plantation. The child stays with you, Thomas said without any lead-up. But there will be conditions. He does not come near the main house. He does not play with my sons. He does not attend lessons. He does not eat at any table where he might be seen by visitors. As far as anyone outside this plantation is concerned, he is your grandson from North Carolina. Nothing more. Is that clear? Yes, sir. You will receive extra rations to care for him. But understand this, Dina. If he becomes a problem, if his presence causes any difficulty whatsoever, I will sell him so far away you'll never hear his name again. I am allowing him to stay out of complicated considerations. But my patience has limits. I understand, sir. Do you? Thomas leaned forward. Do you understand that this child represents the greatest shame of my life? That every time I see him, I see my wife's betrayal? That he is a living reminder of my failure to control my own household? Dina looked at him with old, knowing eyes. I understand that you see shame, sir. But that child didn't choose his circumstances. He's just a boy. He's a problem, Thomas corrected. A problem I am choosing not to eliminate against my better judgment. Don't make me regret that choice. Dina nodded and left, returning to her cabin where little Samuel waited, still unaware that his life had just been debated, judged, and conditionally spared. The weeks that followed were tense. Margaret took to her bed again, this time not with melancholy, but with a deep, desperate shame that clung to her like illness. She saw Dr. Yancey, who prescribed tonics and rest. She wrote letters to her mother, letters she never sent, trying to explain what had happened and why. Thomas threw himself into work, staying away from the house whenever possible. He rode to Richmond often, attended every social gathering that offered an excuse to be gone. He looked at his legitimate sons and tried to feel the same pride he once had, but every time he saw their faces, he saw another face, one that shouldn't have existed, but did. Meanwhile, in the quarters, Samuel continued to grow, unaware of the chaos his existence caused, protected by an old woman who had quietly decided that this was the one fight she would not surrender. The arrangement Thomas forced on them might have lasted if plantation life existed in a sealed bubble. But no plantation was truly isolated, and secrets spread like tobacco blight, unseen until the damage was already beyond repair. The trouble began with visitors. Fairmont Plantation, like all large estates, regularly hosted guests, business partners, relatives, neighbors from nearby plantations. These visits were crucial for maintaining social standing and business alliances. And visitors, especially the women, always wanted to see the children. Thomas Jr. and Henry, now 4 years old, were displayed proudly, dressed in miniature gentlemen's outfits, trained to bow and greet with perfect formality. Margaret, when well enough, would show off their abilities, how Henry could recite Bible passages, how Thomas Jr. could identify letters and write his own name. And during these visits, Someone inevitably wandered across the grounds. They would pass the slave quarters, observe the workers, and sometimes, by pure chance, they would see Samuel. The first incident happened in the fall of 1805, when Margaret's older sister Charlotte visited from Williamsburg with her husband. Charlotte had 3 daughters and had always felt superior to Margaret, especially during the years when Margaret struggled to produce heirs. Now, seeing the strong, healthy twin boys, Charlotte's pride wavered. She found herself searching for anything that might restore her sense of advantage. On the second day of her visit, Charlotte took a morning walk through the plantation grounds. Wealthy white women often did this, pretending to check on the slaves' welfare, but really it was another way of asserting control. Charlotte walked past the rows of cabins, inspecting them with critical eyes, until she reached Dina's cabin at the far end. Samuel was outside, 3.5 years old, playing with a small carved horse Dina had made for him. He looked up with open curiosity as Charlotte approached. Charlotte stopped abruptly. She stared at the child. She saw Thomas's face, small, unmistakable. She saw features she herself shared with Margaret. The child was darker than he should have been, certainly, but the resemblance was undeniable. Whose child is this? Charlotte demanded. Dina stepped out of the cabin, moving quickly to place herself between Charlotte and Samuel. My grandson, ma'am, from North Carolina. Your grandson? Charlotte repeated with sharp skepticism. How convenient. Tell me, when exactly did this grandson arrive? 3 years back, ma'am. Charlotte's mind immediately began sorting through dates and possibilities. 3 years ago was 1802, the same year Margaret had given birth. She remembered the letters Margaret had sent, announcing the twins. But even then, something about those letters had fell off, something she couldn't quite identify at the time. Take me to my sister, Charlotte said abruptly. Now. The confrontation in Margaret's sitting room was brutal. Charlotte dismissed the servants, closed the door, and turned to Margaret with an expression of mingled triumph and disgust. There's a child in the quarters who looks exactly like Thomas, Charlotte said, born the same year as your twins. Would you like to explain that to me? Margaret's face went blank, the expression of someone who had lived in dread for so long that catastrophe almost felt like relief. I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Margaret. I'm your sister. I can see what you've done. What I've done? Margaret snapped, her voice rising defensively. What about what Thomas has done? All these men with their slave women, producing children all over their plantations, and no one says a word. But You're a white woman, Charlotte hissed. It's not the same. You know it's not the same. Why? Because we're supposed to pretend our husbands are faithful while they rape the women they own? Because we're supposed to smile and ignore the children who look like our husbands running through the quarters? That child doesn't look like Thomas, Charlotte said quietly. He looks like your sons. He's too light to be just a slave's child. Margaret, what did you do? The full story didn't come out. Not then. Margaret clung to some last shred of dignity, refusing to confess everything. But Charlotte was intelligent enough to piece together the essential truth. Margaret had been unfaithful, had produced a child of mixed race, and had hidden him in the quarters rather than face the consequences. Does Mother know? Charlotte asked. No, no one knows. Just Thomas and the servants. This will destroy you if it gets out. Destroy all of us. I know, Margaret whispered. Why do you think I've lived in terror for 3 years? Charlotte stood, pacing the room with agitation. She had come expecting a pleasant visit, perhaps some gentle teasing over Margaret's past struggles. Instead, she had uncovered a scandal that threatened the entire family's reputation. That child cannot stay here, Charlotte said at last. He is visible proof of your betrayal. Thomas wants him here. He considers Samuel his son, legally his property. Samuel? Charlotte's voice sharpened. You named him. I didn't. Esther did, the woman who helped. Charlotte processed this with calculating eyes. Then she said coldly, "Then there's a simple solution. The child must disappear properly this time. He's young enough that it can be arranged quietly. An accident, an illness, these things happen all the time with slave children." Margaret felt something inside her rebel, a maternal instinct that 3 years of separation had not completely extinguished. "No, I won't. I can't." "You don't have a choice," Charlotte replied. "Unless you want our entire family destroyed. Unless you want your sons to grow up knowing everyone is whispering that their mother is an adulteress who produced a bastard child. Is that what you want?" The argument stretched on for hours, but the conclusion was inevitable. Charlotte was right. Samuel's continued existence was a danger. And Margaret, worn down by years of fear and guilt, no longer had the strength to resist. When Thomas returned that evening, he found his wife and sister-in-law waiting in his study, united in grim determination. "We need to discuss the child," Charlotte said. "The one in the quarters." Thomas's expression darkened. "That is not your concern, Charlotte. It is when it affects my family's reputation. Margaret has told me everything, and we agree the child must go." "I've already made my decision," Thomas said coldly. "He stays under controlled conditions, but he stays." "Why?" Charlotte snapped. "Out of some misplaced sense of paternity? He's evidence of your wife's betrayal. Every day he remains here is an insult to your dignity." Thomas looked at Margaret, who couldn't meet his eyes. "Is this what you want?" he asked her. "For your son to be removed?" "He's not my son," Margaret said, but her voice broke on the words. "Not really. He can't be." "But he is," Thomas said quietly. "That's the problem, isn't it? He's mine whether I want him or not. And I don't kill what's mine." "Then sell him," Charlotte insisted. "Far away, to someone who will never connect him to this family. He's 3 years old. Who buys a 3-year-old child? Plenty of plantations need young workers. Or there are families in the city who take in children as household servants. It can be done quietly for the right price." Thomas stood silent for a long moment, trapped between conflicting impulses. The practical part of him knew Charlotte was right. Samuel's presence was dangerous. But another part, the part that counted property, bloodlines, and future profits, could not accept the idea of disposing of his own son, regardless of the circumstances. "I'll consider it," Thomas said finally, "but not now. The child stays until I decide otherwise." Charlotte left 2 days later, disappointed but not defeated. She had planted the seed, and she knew Thomas was a practical man. Eventually, logic would win. But Charlotte made one critical mistake before she left. She told her husband about the situation after swearing him to secrecy. And her husband, after several glasses of port at a Williamsburg gentleman's club, mentioned it to a business associate. And that associate mentioned it to his wife. And so the secret began its inevitable spread, leaking out in fragments and whispers, distorting itself as it passed from mouth to mouth. By the spring of 1806, rumors had reached several neighboring plantations. The details were confused. Some said Thomas had fathered a child with a slave woman. Others claimed Margaret had taken a lover. Still others insisted the whole thing was nothing more than a lie spread by jealous competitors. But everyone agreed on one thing. Something was wrong at Fairmont Plantation. Some scandal involving children and hidden parentage. Something that respectable families whispered about but never acknowledged openly. Thomas soon began noticing changes in how people treated him. Conversations would abruptly stop when he entered a room. Business associates interacted with him more coolly, their cordial tone replaced with a thin layer of distance. Invitations to social events, once constant, became noticeably less frequent. There was nothing overt, nothing he could directly confront. But the shift in social temperature was unmistakable. He knew exactly what it meant. The secret was out, spreading like a fever, poisoning his reputation a little more with every retelling. In June of 1806, Thomas finally made his decision. He summoned Denina to his study and told her she needed to prepare Samuel for a journey. The child would be taken to Richmond and placed with a family that needed a house servant. He insisted the boy would be well treated, but he could no longer remain at Fairmont. Dinah received the news with the stillness of someone who had already survived more than most people could imagine. She did not cry, did not protest, but something ancient and wounded flickered behind her eyes. "When, sir?" she asked. 3 days. I've already made the arrangements." Dinah returned to her cabin and looked at Samuel, who sat on the floor playing with his carved horses, lost in some elaborate story known only to him. He was 4 years old now, bright, curious, with his father's intelligence and his mother's unyielding determination, though he would never know either of them as parents. She had raised him for 4 years, a child who wasn't hers by blood, but who had become hers through the quiet alchemy of daily care. She had taught him how to walk, how to speak, how to identify plants and birds. She had told him stories to put him to sleep, held him through nightmares, and loved him as one loves a child who represents far more than just himself. And now he would be taken away, sold to strangers, sent into a life she could not protect him from. Dinah made a decision that was both desperate and deliberate. That night, after Samuel fell asleep, she slipped out of the cabin and walked to Esther's quarters. Esther was already awake when Dinah arrived, as though she had been waiting. They sat outside in the darkness, speaking in whispers that would not carry to neighboring cabins. "Master selling Samuel," Dinah said. 3 days from now, they're taking him to Richmond." Esther's expression did not change, but her fists tightened. "I feared this was coming." "I can't let it happen," Dinah whispered. "I won't. I've lost too many children in my life. I won't lose another one." "What are you planning?" "I'm taking him away." "Running," Esther said. The word hung between them like a knife. Running was the greatest act of defiance, an act that could result in brutal punishment or death. But it was also the only true resistance available to them, the only way to defy the system that owned their lives. "You'll die if they catch you," Esther said bluntly. "Or worse. You know what they do to runaways." "I know, but I also know what they do to children in those city houses. I've heard the stories. Samuel won't survive it. Better to try and fail than to hand him over. You're old, Dinah. You won't make it 50 miles. Your joints can barely carry you around the plantation. Then I'll make it 20, or 10, or 5, however far I can get before they catch me." Esther studied her for a long time, seeing the unwavering determination in the older woman's face. "You need help. I need information. Routes. Safe houses. You know people, Esther. You hear things. Tell me how to do this." Over the next 2 days, Esther gathered every piece of information she could. There were whispered networks, fragile, dangerous routes where runaways might find shelter, places where they could hide, ministers who might offer food, freed families who sometimes risked everything to help escaping slaves. There were also places to avoid, areas where slave catchers prowl like wolves. Esther passed this information to Dinah in fragments, careful to speak only in unobserved moments. They planned with the precision of generals preparing for war, knowing that a single misstep could cost both of them their lives. On the third night, the night before Samuel was scheduled to be taken to Richmond, Dinah prepared to leave. She packed what little she could, some food, a blanket, a small knife. She woke Samuel and dressed him in his warmest clothes, though he was confused and sleepy. "Where are we going, Grandma?" he asked, using the only title he knew for her. "On an adventure," Dinah said, keeping her voice light despite the terror inside her. "We're going to see new places." "Will we come back?" "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe someday." Slipping out of the cabin just after midnight, they moved into the darkness. The plantation was quiet, the main house lit only by a few lamps. Dinah held Samuel's hand and headed for the woods on the eastern edge of the property, not toward the road, where patrols would look for them. They had made it perhaps half a mile when Samuel stumbled on a root and fell, crying out in pain. Dina helped him up and found that he had twisted his ankle. He could still walk, but only slowly, and he began crying in earnest, the adventure turning frightening and confusing. "Hush, baby," Dina whispered urgently. "We have to be quiet. It's part of the game." But the delay cost them precious time. Samuel's injuries slowed them even more. By the time dawn began breaking, they had covered less than 3 miles. Dina knew it wasn't enough. Soon the alarm would be raised. Dogs would be sent to track them. She searched desperately and found a thick grove of trees. She pulled Samuel beneath the low branches and covered them with a blanket. Samuel fell asleep, exhausted from the night's struggle. Denina held him close and prayed to a god she wasn't sure listened to people like her. Back at the plantation, the alarm was indeed raised. Thomas discovered Dina's absence when he went to collect Samuel for the journey to Richmond. The empty cabin told its own story. Thomas's anger was immediate and explosive. He summoned his overseer, the dogs, and ordered a hunting party to be assembled without delay. "Find them," Thomas commanded. "I want that woman brought back." "And the child alive, sir?" the overseer asked. Thomas hesitated, his expression twisting with conflicting emotions. "The child?" "Yes, unharmed." "The woman?" "Use your judgment." The hunting party set out with the dogs before the sun had even risen. The hounds picked up the scent almost instantly, trained for this task all their lives. They followed the trail into the woods, baying with excitement as they closed in. Denina heard the dogs and knew the end had come. She woke Samuel and tried to explain, tried to prepare him for what was about to happen. But how do you make a 4-year-old understand capture and consequence? "I need you to be brave," Denina told him, cradling his small face in her worn hands. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you. Remember you are worth more than they will ever admit. Do you hear me, Samuel? You are worth everything." Samuel nodded, not understanding the words, but sensing the weight behind them. They found them within an hour. 6 men on horseback, 2 carrying rifles, the dogs pulling hard against their leashes. They encircled the grove where Samuel and Denina hid, cutting off every escape. "Come out," the overseer called. "It's over, Dina. Don't make this harder." Denina stepped out slowly, holding Samuel's hand. The child pressed himself against her leg, terrified by the men, the dogs, the tension in the air. "Take the boy," the overseer ordered. "No," Denina said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He stays with me." "You don't get to make demands, old woman. You're a runaway. You know what that means." One of the men dismounted and approached. Denina tried to shield Samuel with her body, but the man was stronger and quickly tore the child from her arms. Samuel screamed, reaching out for her. "Grandma! Grandma!" "It's all right, baby," Denina called back, her voice cracking. "It's all right. Be brave." They tied Denina's hands behind her back and forced her to walk. The men on horseback surrounded her, the dogs trailing behind. Samuel, still crying, was carried by one of the riders. The journey back dragged on for hours. By the time they returned to Fairmont, Denina's feet were bleeding and her body trembled with exhaustion. Still, she held her head high, refusing to show regret. Thomas waited in front of the main house. He took Samuel from the rider and examined him, checking for injuries. Samuel had stopped crying, now silent and wide-eyed from shock. "Take her to the barn," Thomas ordered, pointing toward Denina. 20 lashes, then put her in the storage cellar for 3 days. No food, water only. Denina had expected punishment, but the reality still struck her like a blow. 20 lashes at her age could kill her. The overseer knew it too, hesitating. "Sir, she's old. She might not survive." "Then make sure she does," Thomas replied coldly. "I want her to live long enough to understand the consequences of her choices." They dragged her toward the barn. Seeing this, Samuel began screaming again, fighting in Thomas's grip. "Grandma!" Don't hurt Grandma. Thomas looked down at the child, the root of all his problems, and felt a painful mixture of affection and resentment. Samuel was his son, undeniably, but he was also a reminder of everything Thomas wanted erased from his life. Esther appeared in the doorway, drawn by the shouting. She saw Denina being taken away, saw Samuel trembling in Thomas's arms, and understood instantly that the plan had failed. "Master Fairmont," Esther said softly, "let me take the child. He's frightened." Thomas stared at her, the woman whose mercy had begun all of this. "You knew, didn't you? About Denina's plan?" "No, sir. Don't lie to me, Esther. I gave her information, sir. That's all. I didn't know she would actually run." Thomas could have had her whipped. He could punish everyone who helped her. But he was exhausted, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. "Take him," he said, handing Samuel over. "Keep him in the quarters. I'll deal with all of this tomorrow." Esther carried Samuel away, shielding his ears from the sounds that were already beginning in the barn. Inside, Denina was whipped, 20 lashes delivered with cold, mechanical precision. She screamed at first, then went silent, saving what little strength she had left. When it was over, they left her bleeding on the dirt floor. She would live, barely, but she would never walk without pain again. Infection would haunt her for months. She would spend the rest of her shortened life as a grim warning about the cost of resistance. The failed escape changed everything. Thomas could no longer pretend Samuel could stay at Fairmont under controlled conditions. The child had become too visible, too dangerous to keep, too scandalous to sell. If he sold Samuel, people would wonder why the boy resembled the Fairmont twins so closely. They would talk, speculate, investigate. Thomas felt trapped. Acknowledging Samuel would destroy Margaret's reputation. Getting rid of him would ignite more rumors. Every path led to disgrace. Weeks passed. Thomas drank more, avoided Margaret, avoided Samuel. There was no answer until a letter arrived from Charlotte. His sister-in-law had been making inquiries, using her connections in Williamsburg and Richmond, seeking a way to resolve the crisis quietly. She had found, she explained in her letter, a missionary family preparing to travel into the Western Territories, hoping to establish a church somewhere in the Ohio Valley. They were searching for children to bring with them, orphans, unwanted little ones, anyone in need of a fresh start far from the reach of established society. They ask no questions about parentage, Charlotte wrote. They care only about providing Christian education to children in need. This could be the solution you've been seeking. The child will be taken far enough that he could never return or cause embarrassment. And the family is respectable enough that you could claim, if asked, that you made a charitable contribution to their mission. Thomas read the letter 3 times, weighing every possibility. Ohio lay nearly 1,000 miles west, beyond mountains and along rough, sparsely settled roads. A 4-year-old child sent there would almost certainly never come back. There would be no chance of future complications, no accidental meetings, no uncomfortable questions. Samuel would simply vanish into the emptiness of the frontier. It was, Thomas realized, the perfect solution. Not exactly murder, not exactly abandonment, but a permanent removal, one he could describe as generosity rather than cruelty. He wrote back to Charlotte immediately, accepting her proposal with relief he pretended not to feel. The missionary family arrived at Fairmont Plantation in early September of 1806. Reverend Marcus Hayes and his wife Elizabeth were plain, sincere people in their 30s, driven by conviction to spread Christianity across the frontier. They already had 2 children and had agreed to take 3 additional orphans on their westward journey. Samuel would be the 4th. Thomas welcomed them into his study and presented the situation in the most polished version possible. "The boy is the grandson of one of my workers," Thomas said, the lie smooth and well-practiced. "His mother died in childbirth, and his grandmother is now too old to properly care for him. I believe he would benefit greatly from the education and guidance your mission can provide." Reverend Hayes nodded with understanding. "We have encountered many such cases. Children without proper families who need Christian instruction and stable upbringing. We're happy to include him. He has a name, Thomas added, Samuel, but you are welcome to change it if you feel is appropriate. We'll keep his name, Elizabeth Hayes said gently. Every child deserves to keep at least that much of who they are. Her kindness struck Thomas unexpectedly, a sharp jab of guilt. He forced the feeling away. This was necessary. Samuel will be better off in Ohio, he told himself, free from the stain of his origins, free to create a life among people who knew nothing about Fairmont. Or so he insisted on believing. The day of departure arrived swiftly. Samuel was brought from Esther's cabin. Denina was still too weak to walk, recovering poorly from the whipping, unable even to rise from her bed. The boy didn't understand what was happening, only that he was being taken away by strangers. Esther held him for a long moment before letting go, memorizing every detail of his face, knowing with terrible certainty she would never see him again. "You be good," she whispered. "You listen to these people. You learn everything they teach you. And you remember, you're worth just as much as anybody else. Don't let anyone tell you different." Samuel nodded, not fully understanding her words, but sensing their finality. Margaret watched from her bedroom window as the missionary family's wagon was loaded for the journey. Samuel sat among bundles and blankets beside the other orphan children. She did not say goodbye. She hadn't seen him since the night of his birth, but she stood there now, her palm pressed against the glass, as the living proof of her betrayal was carried out of her life. She expected relief. Instead, she found herself overwhelmed by a hollow, inexplicable grief for a child she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. The wagon rolled away, heading west toward Richmond and then into lands Margaret would never see. Samuel looked back once, frightened and confused, before the trees of the plantation from view, and he disappeared down the road. Thomas stood in his study with a glass of whiskey, telling himself he had made the logical choice, the responsible choice, the only choice. In her cabin, Denina learned that Samuel had been taken, and something inside her simply collapsed. She had survived too much, fought too hard, endured too many losses to withstand this one final blow. She stopped speaking after that day, stopped engaging with the world at all. She lived for another 2 years, but she was never truly alive again. Her mind retreated somewhere unreachable, somewhere untouched by further sorrow. Esther continued working in the main house, serving the family that had shattered so many lives while pretending life remained normal. But privately, she began keeping a journal, writing down Samuel's true story. His birth, his existence, his disappearance. She hid it under a loose floorboard in her cabin. It was insurance against the lies of time. Someday, she wrote, someone will want to know the truth. Someone will ask what happened to Margaret Fairmont's third child. And this journal will be here to answer. The years after Samuel's departure were marked by gradual decay of the plantation, of the marriage, of every illusion Thomas and Margaret had tried to preserve. Their relationship, already fractured, dissolved into cold coexistence. Margaret never recovered from the guilt and loss. She withdrew from society, spending most of her days isolated in her rooms, refusing visitors, avoiding the world. Thomas buried himself in plantation work, chasing productivity as if profit might mend what was broken inside him. Their sons, Thomas Jr. and Henry, grew into young men who knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. They sensed the unspoken misery that filled the main house. Both left for schooling in Richmond as soon as they were old enough, eager to escape the heavy silence of Fairmont. Meanwhile, the plantation itself slumped into ruin. Thomas made reckless investments, poured money into ventures that failed, and borrowed beyond his ability to repay. By 1815, he was forced to sell off significant portions of the estate. By 1820, Fairmont was half its former size, worked by a dwindling population of enslaved laborers. Esther was freed in 1823, not by Thomas's goodwill, but through the terms of his mother's will, which had stated that certain favored servants be freed after 20 years of service. Esther was 47 years old, worn down by decades of labor, but alive and legally free. She moved to Richmond, carrying with her the hidden journal she had guarded for so many years, and found work as a seamstress. Margaret died in 1827 at the age of 42. The doctor called it a wasting sickness, but those who truly knew her understood the truth. She had simply given up, drained by years of guilt, fear, and isolation. Her death passed almost unnoticed outside the immediate family. She was buried in the family cemetery, not far from the empty grave that supposedly held her third son. Thomas survived her by 7 years, dying in 1834 at the age of 62. His obituary in the Richmond newspaper was brief, mentioning only his service in the Virginia House of Burgesses and his management of what had once been a prosperous plantation. There was no mention of scandal, no hint of hidden children or whispered secrets. His estate, diminished and burdened by debt, was divided between Thomas Jr. and Henry, neither of whom wanted anything to do with maintaining the failing property. In 1836, they sold it to a land speculator who divided the grounds into smaller farms. The Fairmont Plantation house still stands today, though it has been converted into a museum and event venue. Tour guides speak of the family's colonial history, of tobacco production, and of the home's architecture, but they do not mention Margaret's third child. They do not speak of conspiracies surrounding his birth or the lives destroyed simply to protect a secret. For more than a century, that secret stayed buried. Esther's journal resurfaced in 1889, discovered in a trunk after her great-granddaughter's death. Unsure how to handle its explosive contents, the family consulted a lawyer who advised them to donate it to the Virginia Historical Society under the condition that it remained sealed from the public for 50 years. The journal was cataloged, boxed, and largely forgotten in the archives. It wasn't until 1952 that a graduate student researching plantation life stumbled upon the journal and recognized its significance. Only then was the truth of Margaret Fairmont's triplets and the dark-skinned child who had been hidden and then quietly sent away revealed to historians. Attempts were made to trace Samuel's fate, to uncover what had become of the child sent west with the Hayes missionary family. But the records from Ohio missions during that era were incomplete and poorly kept. The Hayes family themselves could be traced to the Ohio Territory, where they founded a small church near what is now Cincinnati. But after 1810, the records became unclear. Children died frequently on the frontier, from disease, accidents, and the brutal difficulties of pioneer life. There is, however, one tantalizing possibility. In the 1850 Ohio census, there is a record of a man named Samuel Hayes, age 48, listed as a schoolteacher in a small frontier town. The age is approximately correct. The surname suggests he may have been raised by, or even adopted into, the Hayes family. But without definitive proof, without any document linking the Samuel Hayes to the child born at Fairmont Plantation, historians can only speculate. If it was him, if he survived his childhood, grew into adulthood, and built a life in Ohio, then Margaret's darkest secret had an ending she never imagined. The child she had discarded as too dark, too dangerous, too damaging to her reputation, might have lived a long and meaningful life, free from the plantation system that condemned him at birth. He might have grown into a man able to claim an identity beyond the circumstances of his conception. Or perhaps he died young, just another unnamed victim of frontier hardship, his existence as invisible in death as it had been in life. We will never know for certain. That is the nature of hidden histories, stories that were never meant to be told. The documentation is incomplete. The witnesses are long dead. The truth is obscured by time and by the intentional destruction of evidence. But this much is known. 3 children were born on April 23, 1802, at Fairmont Plantation in Henrico County, Virginia. 2 were acknowledged, raised as heirs, and given every advantage their father's wealth could provide. 1 was hidden, sent away, erased from the family's records and memory. And the question that haunts this story is not only what became of that 3rd child, it is how many other children, And how many other plantation homes were disappeared for similar reasons? How many secrets were buried under floorboards and empty graves? How many lives were destroyed not out of malice, but out of fear? Fear of scandal, fear of social consequences, fear of facing the brutal realities of plantation life. Margaret Fairmont's story is disturbing not because it is unique, but because it is likely not unique at all. The specific details may be rare. Triplets, the striking resemblance, the documented conspiracy. But the underlying situation was common. Plantations were places where sexual exploitation was routine, where children of mixed race were born constantly, where white families clung to the illusion of racial purity, while living side by side with the people they enslaved. The horror of this story is not supernatural. It is human. It is about the choices people make to protect themselves, to preserve their status, to maintain appearances at the cost of truth and morality. It is about a mother who loved her children enough to protect two of them, but not enough to acknowledge the third. It is about a father who claimed ownership over everything on his plantation, except the one son who most needed his protection. It is about a community that chose silence over justice, secrecy over truth, and it is about a child. Samuel, the unwanted triplet, the hidden son, the boy who was too dark to acknowledge, whose life mattered less than his mother's reputation, whose existence was treated not as a life to value, but as a problem to be solved. This mystery reveals that the darkest chapters of history are not always about ghosts or curses. Sometimes they're about flesh and blood, about real people making terrible choices for understandable reasons, about systems that force those choices upon everyone trapped inside them. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was truly revealed, or are there still secrets buried in the archives of Henrico County? Were there other children like Samuel, erased from history by frightened mothers and complicit fathers? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who loves mysteries. The past is full of stories we were never meant to hear. Let's keep listening. See you in the next video.